Okay, good morning everyone. I hope you are doing well and had a great week last week. So we have been studying out the book of Genesis, and last Sunday, if you remember, we did Genesis 37. And if you remember, we learned about how favoritism creates resentments. And resentment turns to bitterness, and bitterness goes to hatred. And of course, hatred turns to revenge. And that's what we saw in the life of Joseph and his interaction with his brothers. Today we're going to look at one of the most curious stories in the Bible, which is found in Genesis chapter 38. It is one of those stories that is deeply disturbing as you read it. In fact, I don't think I ever preached a sermon on this passage or even heard one. It is one of those passages that we tend to skip over. In fact, some people have struggled with this passage so much that they wonder, what is it doing in the Bible? Why is it even there? And this chapter seems to break up the continuity between Genesis chapter 37 and 39. Because in Genesis 37, we see that Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. And in 39, we see that Joseph is as a slave serves in Potiphar's house. And in the middle is Genesis 38, a chapter about Judah and his sons and his widowed daughter-in-law. This isn't a story that we likely to share with our kids. And this passage is among the top 10 passages in the Bible that most preachers tend to skip. Let me tell you my temptation. I struggle with that too. I felt like, let me skip chapter 38 and go to chapter 39. But if this is in the Bible, then there's a reason why God put it over there. So let's study it out today. Because the Bible does that all scripture is God-breathed. So let's go to Genesis chapter 38 and let's read verse 1 to 5. So at this point, we see the focus is on Judah. At this time, the Bible, now who is Judah? He is the fourth born son of Jacob through Leah. He was the one who actually suggested to sell Joseph into slavery instead of killing him. Over here we read that he leaves his family and moves to stay with a man named Hira from Adullam. It looked like this guy was pretty close to Judah because over and over again we hear him, his name come again and again in this chapter. At least 2 more times it comes. So as he moves away from his family, he gets, because he's away, he gets married to a Canaanite woman. Now why was this concerning? Because the Canaanite people, the people from this place, they were Baal worshippers or Baal worshippers, and they were corrupting the family of Israel or Jacob. So through this unwise marriage to Canaanite women, Judah had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. So let's read verse 6 and 7. So now Judah is looking for a wife for his son, his eldest son, and no doubt he chooses a Canaanite woman for his son because he himself was married to a Canaanite. So he found this woman called Tamar. And in verse 7, immediately the Bible says that Judah's firstborn was wicked in the Lord's eyes. We do not know what Earth's wickedness was, but it was so bad that God had to put him to death. Whenever we see in the Bible, when God takes this kind of stand of immediate death, it has to be a very serious sin. Now Tamar just is a newly bride and all of a sudden she becomes a widow. Let's read verse 8. What happens next? Now this is called a Levirate marriage. According to the custom of the Levirate marriage, if a man died before providing sons to his wife, it was the duty of his brother to marry her and to give her or provide her sons. And the first son that is born was considered the son of the brother who died. And later on, this law was quoted also in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5 and 6. In fact, let me read this in English. It says, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. Now, this custom sounds very weird to us today, but this custom was designed to protect the women, ensuring that she had a male provider and a protector. It also ensured the continuance of the family line and that the land or the property would pass down to the next generation. When it comes to culture, we do not understand the culture of other people or other countries, let alone the culture of the past centuries ago. When we think about this custom today or this culture today, we might like, why is that there? We feel awkward about that. But for the people of that time, it was perfectly fine. Today, what we consider acceptable in our culture might not be considered acceptable for the people in future. Things changes, meanings changes in different culture. I grew up in Mumbai with a lot of Gujarati friends. Bombay has a huge population of Gujarati people. Now, Gujarati people are very fun-loving, good people. But when they address a person who is older, in Gujarati, they call them motabai. So in Gujarati, motabai basically is a sign of respect. It's like an elder brother. But if the same person goes to Delhi and calls somebody motabai, that person will get offended. Because what is in Gujarat, an elder brother is a fat person in Delhi, in a Hindi-speaking culture. So let's read further. So that was the culture that was there about. So the next brother is supposed to now get married to Tamar. And let's read verse 9 and 10. So now Onan was supposed to get married to Tamar, his brother's widow. And here, if you notice, he refuses to take responsibility to father the descendant of his dead brother. But if you notice, he was very happy to use Tamar for his sexual gratification. But he did not want to give Tamar a son. So we see over here that Onan uses his brother's wife just for his own pleasure. And what we see over here is, as long as it benefited him, and that's something that we do, as long as it benefits us, we use people to help us to meet our need. But once our need is met, we don't bother with that person anymore. Have you ever been used by people and then discarded, thrown away? Then you know how it feels. And that's how Tamar felt. She felt used and discarded. And what we see over here, when people do that, is selfishness. It is about taking advantage of other people's weakness or their vulnerable position for their own selfish needs. And many times we don't see selfishness as sin. And yet the Bible is very strong about this. If you look in James chapter 3 verse 16, the book of James talks about selfishness. For where there is jealousy and selfishness, there is disorder and every evil practice. According to the book of James, selfishness is an evil practice. In fact, in verse 15, James uses a very strong word. He uses the word demonic. That is something that we got to say. If I am a selfish person, then that is evil in the eyes of God. Selfishness is all about me, me and myself. And in the process, we hurt other people. Onan could have just said that, he did not want to fulfill the role of providing an heir, and he would be set free from that responsibility by Tamar. In fact, in Deuteronomy 25, 7 to 10, let me read this in English. It says that, but if a man does not want to marry his brother's widow, then she must go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He is unwilling to perform the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his city must summon him and speak to him. If he persists saying, I don't want to marry her, then his sister-in-law must approach him in view of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. Then she will then respond, thus may it be done to any man who does not maintain his brother's family line. His family name will be referred to in Israel as the family of the one whose sandal was removed. So all that Onan had to do was say no, and the worst case scenario was Tamar would have to spit on his face. That's all. but he would be free from that responsibility. So what Onan did was evil in the sight of God, and he too was put to death by God because of his selfishness. So now Tamar is widow again. 2 sons died, 2 husbands dead. What would you say about a wife like Tamar, who brought in 2 death in the family? People would say, oh, she's evil, she's bad luck. As soon as she came into the family, 2 of the men in the family died. The blame would be on her instead of the husband who were evil and killed because of their own evil action. We see that even today in our country and in many cultures. When a husband dies, the women are blamed for bringing bad luck in the family. Or if women are not able to conceive and have children, the women are blamed for not having children. So what did Judah do in verse 11? So we see over here that Judah is telling his daughter-in-law Tamar to go to her father's household and live as a widow till the youngest son grows up. In fact, Judah did not want to give his 3rd son to be married to Tamar because he feared that he too might die. So even as he sends Tamar back to her house, deep down he had no intention of keeping his promise to Tamar. So let's read further. What happens now? A lot of time passes by. Now Judah's wife, she dies, and we'll read from 12 onwards, 12 to 19. So what we see over here that a long time has passed by, and now the youngest son Sheila has grown up, and yet there is no news from Judah to give him as Tamar's wife. So Tamar decides to take matters in her own hands. She comes to know from somebody that her father-in-law is on her way to Timnah on a business trip to shear the sheep. And so what she does is she disguises herself and sits on the way. She sits at the entrance of the place where Judah is going to come. And Judah thinks that she is a prostitute. And so he wants to sleep with her, and she asks, what are you going to give to me in exchange for this favor? He said, I'll send you a goat. And, she takes a pledge, basically her ring, her cord, and her staff as a pledge till she sends the goat. Judah slept with his own daughter-in-law without realizing it. But Tamar knew exactly what she was doing. So why did Tamar did that? What made her do this? The 2 things that I could think about is, number 1 was, Tamar did not want to face what would be very difficult to live in that culture. A life with no husband and no children. A widow with no children are always taken advantage of, even in our world. Forget about that world, that time. But also the second reason was Tamar did not have an option of just finding another man to marry. That option was not available to her because she was under the headship of her father-in-law, Judah. He had to provide her a husband. It was Judah who would decide whom she should get married and when she should get married. So, in a way, Tamar was at the mercy of her father-in-law regarding her future. And though she waited for a long time, and seeing that Judah was not keeping his word, she decided to take matters in her own hand. Now, I'm not saying what she did was right. Let's read what happened. So, in verse 20 to 23, we won't have time to read that. So, afterwards, when Judah goes back with the same friend, he sends a goat back to keep his word and to get back his stuff. But after that incident, Tamar disappears, and when this friend of Judah goes with a goat, he doesn't find anybody. In fact, there is nobody there. There is no prostitutes over there. And he comes back with the goat and tells Judah that there is no such thing. Now, what we notice over here is about Judah is, when it comes, he keeps his word. When it comes to sending the young goat to Tamar. But when it comes to giving his youngest son to be married to Tamar, he ignores it. That just showed that he was willing to keep his word as long as it was convenient. It happens to us too, right? As long as it is convenient, we'll keep our promise. But as soon as it gets hard, it gets difficult, it gets a little costly, we back up from keeping our word. So now 3 months passes. So in verse 24, it says, about 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. The first response of Judah if you notice over here, is bring her out and let her be burnt. And it was so easy for Judah to pass a judgment on someone else who had sinned without realizing that he has also sinned and he is also under the same judgment. And many times, many of us are guilty of the same sin. We find it very easy to see the other's sin, others' fault, and pass judgment, but we refuse to use the same standard to ourselves. We're quick to condemn others, but show a lot of grace to ourselves. How about showing the same amount of grace to others as we show to ourselves? In fact, in Matthew 22, verse 39, the second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. The second greatest commandment, according to Jesus, is love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, treat your neighbor with the same standard as you treat yourself. Imagine if you all take this seriously, this command seriously, our world will be such a beautiful place to live, a safe place to live, a beautiful place to live. Let's see what happens as we close out this passage, 25 to 27. Now, when she was accused of prostitution and was almost put to death, Tamar acted very shrewdly, and she basically said, hey, by the way, I became pregnant by the man who owned this, and she showed Judah's ring, the cord, and the staff. In verse 26, the Bible said Judah recognized that and took complete responsibility. In fact, he said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son. We see the good side of Judah, a saving grace of Judah, taking complete responsibility of what happened with Tamar. He said that because I did not give her my son Sheila to her, this is what she did. Verse 28 to 30, we see over here that Tamar gives birth to her twins. And one of the sons is called Perez. And if you read the book of Matthew chapter 1 verse 3 and Luke chapter 3 verse 33, both of them list Perez as the ancestor of Jesus, the Messiah. And what we see over here is God took the son of this ungodly situation and put him in the family line of the Messiah, despite the fact that neither Judah nor Tamar were example of godliness. So why is this chapter in the Bible? To see God's grace, that he can choose an ungodly situation and he can still work with it. It gives us hope to you and me that God is not done with you and me. No matter what we have done in our past, he still desires to use us in spite of all the mess we have created in our life. So what can we learn from this chapter today? What are some lessons we can take away today? Lesson number one, beware of the influence of the world. Judah allowed himself to get influenced by the world by marrying a Canaanite, which influenced his children towards wickedness and got them killed. Lesson number two is selfishness hurts. And we see over here, Onan was selfish and got him killed. Lesson number three, beware of passing judgment on others without realizing that, hey, we are also guilty of sins that we have committed. Because Judah was quick to pass judgment on Tamar. And the last lesson we learned today is God is still gracious in spite of our sinfulness. He's willing to use the ungodly act of Judah and Tamar and still chose them to be the ancestor of Jesus, the Messiah. And what we see at the end is God's immeasurable grace in using Judah and Tamar. That's the God we worship. Many times we think that God in the Old Testament is an angry God. But over and over again, if you notice over here, we see him being so gracious, so patient, so merciful, so caring, that we are not able to see that. Amen. I hope you learned something today. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you. Have a great week.